All right, Mike, we're back again with another show in our preseason preview series. And this time today, we're going to be talking about the MAC. So we're continuing our run through the group of five conferences. Before we get started, anything that kind of stands out to you in regards to any preseason drafts that you've done, any spring drafts, spring best balls, that seems to be some type of an overlying theme or common theme between teams in this conference or just a conference in general?
High-end talent, actually, now that I give it some thought. Like you're getting the top flight running backs, Marquez Cooper, Samson Evans and kind of those first,
Bangura.
Bangura, yes, thank you, in the first four rounds. And then obviously the Ohio offense. But then after that, it's just kind of I don't want to say wasteland, but there's not a lot of proven talent that we know for certainty is going to be, the wide receiver one here, running back one for, a Bowling Green, stuff like that. So I think high end talent is pretty good this year in the MAC, but a lot of question marks as well.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. And let's just start off with Akron, right? Because to our surprise, probably one of the teams with the most fantasy appeal from a total number of players, right? Which is really different. I mean, you look at quarterback DJ Irons, you've got Alex Adams returns. I know that you've become an increasingly higher on Daniel George at that wide receiver two spot for Akron, which last year there were three receivers that received a significant amount of targets. And then you had the running back, under Moorhead can be very productive in that offense. They bring in Lorenzo Lingard. Did he find finally his right landing spot? And if so, he could, be a great fantasy asset for folks if he can live up to the expectations in that Moorhead offense. So what are your thoughts about Akron, some of the players and that offense in general from a fantasy perspective?
Yeah, fun team, I think, potentially in CFF. I think every skill position aside from tight end probably is going to be relevant in CFF this season. And I just kind of reading up, I don't think they're going to be like drastically better like defensively to where they can slow the pace or they are going to need to score again this year to win games. So I think it could be a fun offense. I like DJ Irons, kind of like you mentioned. It's interesting that he got the rushing workload that we've seen from a Moorhead quarterback in the past with like a Nick Fitzgerald comes to mind immediately, right? DJ Irons was averaging 13, 14 carries a game, and he just didn't have the touchdown equity, which, if Akron's slightly better this year, hits the red zone a little bit more, maybe he can get to 6, 7 touchdowns, which really boosts his stock. So Irons intriguing, running backs intriguing. I've been drafting Lingard more, probably with what came out of the spring with Cam Wiley transferring out. Clyde Price, who was effective at times last year, I believe is out for the season now due to injury. So there's a really clear path for Lingard to step into that running back one role, which, as you alluded to, has been very profitable in CFF under Joe Moorhead. Travis Dye, Saquon Barkley, probably obviously better players, but we've got proven production out of the running back position. Just to close my part on Akron, yes, I've been increasingly interested in Daniel George, who was going 10 rounds after Alex Adams. And I don't know, just taking a second look. I mean, I know nine touchdowns compared to 2 touchdowns for Daniel George, but they got Daniel George was averaging more targets per game than Alex Adams. The average depth of target and yards per route run were nearly identical between the two. And it's not like Daniel George, small slot receiver. He's 6'2", outside receiver. Like, you can see a situation where maybe that 9-2 disparity between him and Alex Adams, the gap narrows this year.
Well, talking about the system and running backs, let's go over to Ball State. And I think we're going to go from Ball State to Kent State just, within the same conversation as far as transitioning from team to team, because, Ball State loses running back Carson Steele to UCLA. We'll get into that situation as we get into the Pac-12 preview. But Kent State lost obviously they lost head coach Sean Lewis who went out west to become the offensive coordinator for Deion Sanders out at Colorado. That in turn created a domino effect with Steele moving out to UCLA and Marquez Cooper then transferring from Kent State over to Ball State. And if that system holds true and, Cooper's track record holds up at Ball State, there's no reason to suggest that he can't have a monster year over in that Ball State system. And for us, we've got him listed. I think both you and I have him around the top 5. So from a fantasy standpoint, I know they brought in Lane Hatcher there at quarterback, who has, I think he's bounced around to 4 or 5 different programs. That wide receiver 1 in that Ball State offense has had some fantasy appeal. There's more question marks right there than usual. But Marquez Cooper right now stands out as the, he's cemented as that top option in that Ball State offense right now, right?
No doubt. Just real quick, because you mentioned them in conjunction,
Yep.
0 interest Kent State this year. The least amount of returning production on offense of any team in college football. This is a year 0 situation. We'll look to them. We'll look for some tendencies this year that maybe can translate to next year. But as far as fantasy, completely out on Kent State. Ball State, interesting. I think in our last draft, you took Marquez Cooper in the first round.
I had pick 111 and 2-2. So I took Cooper and Bangura with back-to-back picks right there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obviously once he gets the MAC play, Marquez Cooper is going to smash, given the propensity for this coaching staff to just feed the running back. One, Marquez Cooper, despite being smaller in stature, it's been reported that he was like one of the toughest guys on the Kent State roster. So like size isn't a hindrance. He's proven it, right? He's gotten 250 carries already in his career before. I think that's just plug and play. The thing I would suggest with Cooper, and we've mentioned this in years prior with some players, you want to marry him up in drafts with a guy that's going to have a good start to the season, because you look at those first 2 games for Cooper and Ball State, at Kentucky, at Georgia. Mm-hmm. You're definitely not going to start him in those 2 games, right? Yep. So I think it's imperative that in those drafts, you kind of look for running backs that have a easier path to fantasy success to start the season. Just for example, I'm looking at LaQuint Allen would be a great pairing with a Marquez Cooper. LaQuint Allen plays Colgate out of the gate and then Western Michigan. I think you'll start LaQuint Allen over Marquez Cooper in those weeks. That's just kind of the strategy that me and you both take when drafting those players. Outside of that, I mean, tight ends at Ball State, I think I'm passing on the receivers personally. Shouldn't say I hate. I strongly dislike Lane Hatcher as a quarterback, even dating back to Arkansas State. So kind of out on the receivers there. Hopefully he's at least serviceable enough for these tight ends. I was kind of looking into this, a little bit interesting. I have Tanner Koziel and Brady Hunt right next to each other in our rankings. I forget where you have them ranked. But I found it interesting that, I don't know who, I didn't know who necessarily I strongly favored over the other, if anybody. Koziel was not as efficient as Hunt. He had 12 more targets, but significantly less receptions. But he had more touchdowns, and I think this is interesting. If you want to deep dive on tight end production, go take a look at Eric Froton's article on NBC Sports, where he dove into kind of the splits where tight ends will move outside. We'll get to this point with like an Oronde Gadsden, right, where he's split out essentially as a receiver. 4.1% Brady Hunt was split out wide. He's mostly an inline kind of tight end, right around the line of scrimmage. 14.8% for Brady Hunt, who had more touchdowns. If he can that was Tanner Koziel had 7 touchdowns, more touchdowns. He was split out wide more, 14.8%. If he can catch more passes with the targets that he's getting, I think he can finish out as maybe the clear tight end one.
Yeah, and I have them switched. I have Hunt right now over Kozoil.
It's not a sorry.
And I think it's also important to note both of those guys were true freshmen last year too, right? I believe both of them were true freshmen. So now you're getting them both as a sophomore. And right now going into the season, if you had to ask me who were their top two receivers, I'd have to put the two tight ends at the top of the list, right?
Right there with you. Yep.
And I'll come back since we kind of touched on Kent State and you said that you didn't want anything to do with them. I do want to throw one name out there. I do think running back Kai Thomas is worth adding on your watch list to start the year. We mentioned Kent State, total transition now in year one, but we know the head coach is Kenny Burns, came over from Miami. He brings Kai Thomas back with him. He was at Miami when he was there. The offense should be at least somewhat established continuity in the system with Matt Johnson being promoted from that last year's staff as offensive coordinator. Let's see if Kent State can maybe figure some things out through the first 3 or 4 weeks. I wouldn't leave Kai Thomas off the watch list once Kent State rolls into conference play. I do think you might, if he establishes himself at running back one and the offense is just somewhat efficient, could be a week-to-week play somewhere as you get into those midweek games in MAC conference.
Yeah, you would need them to be averaged, but
sure,
because or they're not going to be good. They're not going to be good on offense. No. If they're average, then Kai Thomas is potentially.
Yeah, and I don't think either one of them are expecting, for them to blow through the roof. But just to name, if I'm going to throw one right now, it would be him and probably Trell Harris at receiver, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Well, let's go over to Bowling Green, Mike. And it was interesting because in sort of the, in our biggest questions going into the new year, which you do a great job with that, writing up all the teams and all the conferences, our biggest questions based off of some of the conversations that you and I have had. You put together a nice piece on Bowling Green that under Scott Loeffler, he's been more pass oriented with Bowling Green just recently than his systems have been in the past. Are we expecting to see more of that this year at Bowling Green?
Maybe. Not for sure. I mean, it's been the past 2 years that they've thrown it over 50%, which is not usual for a Scott Loeffler style of offense. I don't think that's what he prefers to do. The running game has been terrible. So I think there's potential maybe for it to be a little better. You get Terrion Stewart back after suffering an injury, I believe, last year. He missed all of last season. I was reading the Bowling Green offensive line, I think, should be one of the better groups in the MAC conference next year. So I think there's potential where they don't throw it as much this year if they can establish the run a little bit more. But the proven talent is definitely with their pass catchers, right? Get Odue Hilaire, 91 targets last year. You get back Austin Osborne, a former Washington transfer, also had 90 targets the year prior. And then my personal favorite, Harold Fannin, the tight end, just a freshman last year. He was the tight end too, but caught 19 passes on 25 targets. And he's going to step into the tight end one role that has posted 60 targets in each of the last 2 seasons. Plus, he had 3 or 4 rushing touchdowns last year. So I think he can be a really strong asset at the tight end position on your fantasy roster. I think top 10 potential if he gets those 60 targets and those handful of rushing touchdowns that he got.
And you're referencing Harold Fannin, right?
Yep.
Now, look, let's go over to Buffalo, Mike, where, we talked about, so I get that with Bowling Green, right? So you kind of figure, a program like that, they're going to play to their strength. And that's probably why they've thrown the ball a little bit more. They've got Hilaire coming back at receiver as well, Bazelak at quarterback. But let's transition over to Buffalo, where I think we could maybe make a comparison here to Buffalo, not exactly talent-wise, but a situation where Ron Cook comes back as like this super senior, right? And we were probably eyeing a guy like Mike Washington thinking, this could be the year where we want to really target Mike Washington. And then Ron Cook comes back. You look at this offense last year, Mike Washington had 150 carries, Ron Cook 139. The quarterback Cole Snyder had 110. You had Al-Jay Henderson, who was like the talk of preseason camp going into last year. He averaged about 6 carries a game last year. So a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. And then Ron Cook coming back really just complicates things a little bit from a fantasy perspective. And I think draws similar comparisons right now with the depth at Buffalo to the conversation we had on the previous show over in the Mountain West with what we were talking about with Ashton Genty and George Halani over at Boise State, where Cook coming back now kind of muddies the water and really lessens the stock of someone like Mike Washington, right?
Yeah, similar to Boise State in that sense, but dissimilar in the fact that we should not give a rat's what about this backfield, in my opinion. I think twice last season, a Buffalo running back had 20 or more carries in a game. They have a new offensive coordinator, DJ Mangus. And if you look back 2 years at William and Mary was his last stop a few years back, I think 2017 and 2018. His running back won those 2 seasons, averaged 10.9 fantasy points per game. He utilized the committee. Probably, I don't think they were utilized heavily in the passing game. Probably not if they're only averaging 11 fantasy points per game. So I'm out on that backfield. It's just not the same from when that previous staff was at Buffalo, right? So with Lance Leipold. So I think that's in the past now with this new coaching staff. As far as any other interest, I think receiver could be interesting because I think they're going to have to throw a little bit more this year with not a proven piece at the wide receiver position. Put Nick McMillan, a redshirt freshman, on your radar. 6'1", 224 pounds. He's got really good size. Had 130 yards and a pair of scores in the spring game. Phil Steele actually had him as a 4th-team All-MAC wide receiver, so he's high on him. I think that's a guy that could become a household name, if not this year, down the road for Buffalo.
Yep. Now, look, let's get it. Well, before we transition away from Buffalo, anything on the receiver side that's worth mentioning? We had a conversation about this. There's really no one that really is jumping off the charts for us. Or are we even considering anything in the passing game right now?
Yeah, Nick McMillan, I just mentioned him. I think he's going to be the guy that we're kind of look for to step up into potential wide receiver 1. If not wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. They bring in Daryl Harding, a Duke transfer, but the issue with him, Marlon Johnson, who's a holdover from last year, these guys just haven't done anything in their careers. So we're trending towards the upside pick in redshirt freshman Nick McMillan as a potential contributor at receiver for Buffalo.
Yep, I agree. Now, listen, this is the one that's really interesting is Eastern Michigan, right? We've had a lot of conversations about Eastern Michigan. There seemed to be some cryptic messages maybe coming out on whether or not Samson Evans was injured. Is he? There seems to be some just unknowns right now about that situation. He's being drafted as if everything's normal, but you and I have a little bit of hesitation on this, and I hate to go too deep because we don't know what's rumor and what's confirmed. But we did get a hint that from somebody covering Ohio in the spring that Evans did have some sort of injury, right?
Yeah, it's one. I even forget what the Twitter handle was, but it was a Twitter handle that does cover Eastern Michigan, and I guess they attended the spring game. They saw Samson Evans in a boot. So it wasn't me. It was a friend of the site, Josh Chevalier, who was DMing back and forth, but we kind of followed up on that when they saw him in a boot, and they kind of backed off and saying like, hey, we don't think it's going to be a long-term injury, at least from what they saw from the stands or wherever they were sitting. But that's enough hesitation for me, especially with the kind of coverage that we're going to get from Eastern Michigan, which is nothing. That I'm comfortable enough to I don't have any shares of Samson Evans.
Well, I think this is one of those. Look, 249 carries for 1,100 plus yards, 15 touchdowns last year, right? Which last year, if you remember going into the year, you were like, look, this could be a regression year. He had 83 carries and 13 touchdowns in 2021. It was far from a regression year. He actually did really well. I think if you're in traditional formats, don't hesitate in drafting Samson Evans whatsoever. We just have hesitation in best ball formats because in our formats, you don't get any, there's no in-season management. So if you draft a guy that there's a hint of injury and he doesn't play at all or he's hurt half the year, you're just not getting any production and you're down basically a roster spot. If you're in more of a traditional format, you've got to draft him as if nothing's going on right now, and you've got potential to get a 200 plus double-digit running back, right?
Yeah,
double-digit touchdown running back. Yeah,
they ran it the most since 2014 last year under Chris Creighton, and like you said, Evans is back. Their backup Jalen Jackson is back. Most of the offensive line, I believe, is back. So, and then obviously you're replacing so many pieces at wide receiver that, I mean, the roster construction is alluding to Eastern Michigan running the ball heavily again in 2023.
Yeah. To that point, Tanner Canoe, 45 receptions, led the team with 632 yards. That's it last year. Did score 9 touchdowns. So there is a little value there in the passing game with Eastern Michigan.
Yeah, and we're going to make a change actually in our projection. I told you about this earlier. Javon Swinton, Indiana transfer. Just kind of reading up, it sounds like he's going to be the wide receiver 2 there. High floor, you're probably looking at around 37 receptions, which is going to be our projection. Yeah. But out of the wide receiver 2, you haven't seen more than 6 touchdowns in the season. So got to keep on your radar. Maybe he emerges, but just that's a change that we're going to make.
Yeah, over at Miami of Ohio, Mike, Brett Gabbert comes back at quarterback. We're used to running back rotation in that offense now for a couple of years. I don't think we're expecting anything different this year. But there's value in that wide receiver 1 spot at Miami of Ohio this year. Are we confident right now in wide receiver 1, with Miles Marshall there? That's who we're sitting. You've got Joe Wilkins, the transfer that came over from Notre Dame. Traditionally, wide receiver 1 in this offense is a nice fantasy asset. But should we temper expectations right now?
Yeah. I mean,
temper expectations as a, when relatively speaking, comparing what we think Marshall could do this year compared to what the wide receiver 1 has done in that offense over the past 3 years.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't have a great answer for that question, to be honest. It's interesting, though, that if you look at it last year, Marshall was actually slightly more efficient than Mac Hippenhammer was. He had less drops and he had a better conversion rate on his targets. So, and he had a higher yards per reception at 16 yards per. So, I mean, those are a couple signs that maybe Marshall can step right into that wide receiver 1 spot. Joe Wilkins, a P5 transfer coming in from Notre Dame, maybe he challenges for that spot, but he's a newcomer. Marshall was with the program obviously last year. He's the only receiver that caught a pass for Miami of Ohio last year that's on the roster currently. So I mean, that's just my lean. And he's, do you remember if he was drafted in our best ball? I don't think he was. And
I don't remember him being drafted.
Yeah, and that could potentially be a mistake. Just look at the last 3 years. You're getting 30% target share, which is the magic number that we want for a wide receiver. Jack Sorensen, 2 years. Mac Hippenhammer, he did fine last year, but that's the money spot in this offense, is the outside wide receiver 1.
Yeah. Now, Mike, a little speaking with some more unknowns, we go over to Western Michigan now. We've got head coach Lance Taylor, offensive Billy Kosh. We're going to get, I think, some up-tempo play here from Western Michigan, but, we're a little, the pieces right now, are they really in place? Keyshawn King for me is an intriguing option at running back. But Western Michigan, for me, one of those teams where I'd like to see how things are going to play out. And, who knows, there might be, much like I mentioned with Kai Thomas, running back at Kent State, maybe in season, we get 1 or 2 that emerge that could be some sort of a week-to-week play based on a matchup here or there. But anything really sticking out to you at Western Michigan right now? So obviously Sean Tyler transferred out, went to Minnesota, and then they bring in Keyshawn King.
Yep. I was just going to kind of, just as a summary, they're going to, new offense coordinator, Billy Kosh, comes over from VMI, not sure what that stands for, but VMI, Virginia Military Institute. I think that's it. VMI and Richmond, so where he spent the last few years. They're going to run fast, right? They're gonna play fast pace. 76 plays per game on average, which would have been top 20 in the FBS last year. So they're going to play at a fast pace, and they're going to throw the ball right around 40 times a game, probably again this year, just given, new coaching staff, turnover on the roster. You might be playing behind in some games. So I would expect them to throw more than in years past. As a result, I think I'm going to disagree a little bit, and I'm going to be more inclined to invest in the receivers as opposed to Keyshawn King, the running back. Last year, the Richmond offense, I thought this was intriguing. That offense dominated last year, but they had 3 wide receivers with 100 targets last year. It's a high volume passing offense, right? And there's a lot of question marks with that Western Michigan receiving room, but you got a guy that I'm going to start drafting after taking a second look. Jelani Galloway, he was the wide receiver 2 last year, or finished as Boston College transfer. He was second on the team in targets and receptions. He split time last year in the slot and out wide, primarily out wide, but he can play some slot. He's 5'11". 2 of the last 3 wide receivers under Billy Koch were slot receivers, and they got 100 targets in a season. So,
Yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely not an ignore. But like I said, if you want to take a shot right now, I think that's the best name you're throwing out. I mean, obviously, look, they brought Hayden Wolf at quarterback, right? So they did try to make some upgrades there. Whether or not he sticks as a starter remains to be seen. However, they did bring him in. But again, could be one of those offenses that we need to see a couple of weeks play out, and there could be some tremendous fantasy value there when Western Michigan gets in the heart of their conference schedule.
Yep, I think Keyshawn King, who you mentioned, and Jelani Galloway, the 2 former ACC transfers. I think those are the 2 names that you keep on your radar.
Now, Mike, let's go over to Northern Illinois, where last year, they suffered some injuries. They've got Rocky Lombardi back now. The wide receiver that they had get hurt, Trayvon Rudolph, that they lost, he was out for all of last year. So they get those pieces back. Now, how does that translate to an improved running game, which was really the strength of that NIU team a couple of years ago? Remains to be seen. The one thing that we do know is that Ontario Brown really stands out to us right now because Harrison Whaley transferred out. Jaden Cradle, another running back, transferred out. They did bring in Gavin Williams as a transfer in. So they do have what seems to be probably their 1-2 punch now. We were expecting a lot out of that NIU running game last year. It didn't quite pan out as we had hoped. Should we be more hopeful this year on an improved running game and fantasy production from Ontario Brown?
Yes, I not just because I'm a graduate of NIU, but I really do think it's going to be a bounce back season. And I think not having your quarterback and not having your best receiver played a huge part in that. Now, there were some questionable coaching decisions, and I think people, rightly so, are starting to question Thomas Hammock. I mean, he had last year, which was the 5th losing season for NIU in the last 20 years. 3 of those have come under Thomas Hammock's direction. So there are certainly question marks about Hammock and this staff, but I think a lot of that was just circumstantial, and that you didn't have your starting quarterback, and the guys that came in were downright awful, and you didn't have your best playmaker on the outside. So they bring back a veteran group, Rocky Lombardi at quarterback, Rudolph, as you mentioned, Ontario Brown, Gavin Williams in the backfield. They also added Kendrell Flowers, a Wake Forest transfer, so he's a potential 3rd option. And then a veteran offensive line. So I think all the pieces are kind of in place for this NIU offense to bounce back. We'll see. I'm hopeful.
Now, look, 3 teams left. Let's start with the one that we're most secure about right now, Ohio, right? You mentioned at the top, that was one of the teams. You've got Curtis Rourke at quarterback. We've got Saban Gora at running back. You've got Sam Wiglas I still don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Mike. So, but those three options are really nice. They have some fantasy appeal. They're really great options, particularly as Ohio gets into MAC play. Other than those three, first of all, is there anything you want to add on to the three to kind of make them more attractive to some of our listeners out there? And are there any other players on your radar right now at Ohio?
No, I was hoping you had more talking points because I think that I wrote that in our guide for Ohio. It's like where's the weakness on those offense, right?
Yeah.
87% returning production. You get two of your top three receivers back, if not two of your top three receivers back. Bangura's back. Curtis Rourke. I think that was the biggest question mark entering the spring. Curtis Rourke had the injury late last season. Would he be healthy? The reports came out that he was dressed for the spring game, participated in a few drills. So I think he should be ready for the regular season. Outside of that, I think this offense should be humming once again this season.
Well, that's where this show, like when the pieces are in place, that's when like we know what we're going to get. I think with it, there's better conversation when there's a little bit of unknown or there's some differences of opinion. But you and I are both pretty aligned with Ohio. I think what you see is what you're going to get. Proven pieces coming back. It's like boom, check. Let's move on to the next team. So you and I have a ton of confidence in that Ohio offense this year.
I do. I would say the one hindrance that I would say is the schedule potentially.
Mm-hmm.
You have to deal with the 2 bye weeks with Ohio players. And then in the non-conference, you have San Diego State and Iowa State, which I believe both are road games. Not going to be easy. So, you're going to have to kind of deal with that when you're drafting Ohio players is let's balance out the roster, maybe have some guys ready to deal with the bye weeks, deal with a relatively tough non-conference.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ohio, one of the rare teams that has 2 byes in the 12-week fantasy schedule. If you play week 0, if you don't include that, and one of those byes is in week 10 later on in the season. So just something to consider when you're talking about Ohio. But let's get into Toledo, Mike, because for me, I've made no, I haven't really kind of sugarcoated anything. I love Dequan Finn. I've talked about that. We've talked about the Toledo quarterback situation. I think you even referenced it in your conference notes, how the quarterback 2 at Toledo has seen significant amount of playing time during the season. Now, that calls into question Finn's durability. Had Finn been more durable last year, the question would remain, had we seen, his backup come in and play, which when he did was really good. So you would think that there would be, he'd be in line to get some snaps this year. I'm talking about Tucker Gleason, obviously, but Quinn, one of those players that I look at, and when we do his projections, it's hard to figure in and take into account any type of injury. And he's one of those players that I look at and say, man, if they get a 12-game, if as a fantasy owner you get a 12-game fantasy schedule out of Dequan Finn, he's easily a top 10 quarterback.
Yeah, I think this is a longer topic, but it's always tough with projections trying to bake in a potential injury, which we've seen at Toledo, right? Sure. The 2 stats that really stuck out to me when researching Dequan Finn, and you mentioned it, the injury has played a part. Injury and not always injury, but injury and kind of ineffective play. I thought it was really funny to see that the quarterback 2 for Toledo has thrown for at least 800 yards in the last 5 seasons. Like that's how much.
Yep.
The backup has played a role.
That's
in the
no
Toledo
small
offense.
change. That's a significant amount of yards.
And you add that to Dequan Finn potentially if he starts all 12 games, you're looking at easily a top 10 producer. The other thing I thought of, or the other stat that I found with Finn last year, which was interesting to me, he missed 1 game against Eastern Michigan, and then this was a frustrating moment for DFS players. If you remember this, in the final week of the season, he played 2 maybe 3 series on a bum ankle in the finale against Western Michigan. The guys were trying to decide, oh, am I going to start Tucker Gleason? Am I going to start Dequan Finn? If you Finn last year finished as QB 24, averaging 28 points per game. If you take out that Western Michigan game where he only played a handful of series and scored 0 fantasy points, he jumped from QB 24 to QB 13 and finished the season averaging 31.3 fantasy points per game. So if he stays healthy, I think anybody who drafts him is potentially going to smash, and he'll end up as a top 10 quarterback.
Yeah. Yep. Good point. Now, any fantasy appeal outside of Dequan Finn, because he's the one that we're kind of steadfast with. You got Juwan Newton there, I think, coming back at receiver. Is there some value there? Is a little bit of value in at the tight end spot? And quite frankly, what do we make of the running backs? Because, just up until a couple of years ago, running backs was fantasy gold for over at Toledo. But now, we're scratching our heads. It's more of a committee approach this year, or it was last year, right? You had Marquez Stewart had 134 carries, Finn had 130, Penny Boone 116, Micah Kelly 120. You had 4 players that had over 100 rushing attempts in that offense. What does that say? What are we to make of that going into 2023?
Yeah, I'm not too high. I don't know how you feel. I'm not high on Juwan Newton. It's been 5 years since a wide receiver at Toledo's averaged more than 13 fantasy points in a game per game. So I think people view him probably as a better player than he actually is, or I view him as a better player than a fantasy asset. Maybe people think otherwise. Toledo only throws the ball 43% of the time, so it's not a high volume passing attack. As far as the running game, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts because I don't have a strong opinion. Stewart is not very, but he's on the smaller side, right? He had a strong close the last year with 200 yards in the last 2 games, but I don't see him as a bell cow type running back that we've seen from Toledo.
Well, the problem you have with the running game is Marquez Stewart did have a late run, right? He had 130, like I mentioned, 4 guys with over 100 plus rush attempts. If one of those running backs establishes himself as the bell cow, then all of a sudden you've got 1,000-yard back that potentially has double-digit touchdowns, right? But, you look at Penny Boone, he averaged 3.82 a carry. Micah Kelly, 3.32. Stewart did average more than 5.5 yards per carry, but like you said, can he really hold up to 200 carry season? We already have questions about whether or not Dequan Finn will stay healthy. He played 12 games, but to your point, he was banged up last year, still had 130 carries. And as a little bit of a counterpoint to what you said as far as running versus passing, the one thing to keep in mind is that they had 23 rushing touchdowns last year. They still threw 31 touchdowns as a team. So Newton had 9 of those, and Jamal Turner, who was at tight end, had 8. So even though they may be a little bit more run heavy, the offense showed, and to your point where Finn could finish as a top 10 quarterback, if he's able to kind of near that 30 touchdown mark in passing and he stays healthy for 12 games and really can eclipse that 600-700 yard mark and potential double digit rushing touchdowns. I know we're back on Finn, but I feel like that's where we've gone with this with Toledo. It's come full circle. That just the more I look at it, the more questions I have around the roster and the more certainty I have in Dequan Finn.
Yeah, I think did he throw for 30? How many touchdowns did he throw?
Well, they threw for 31 as a team, right? So
yeah.
When you look at the numbers, he threw for 23. Gleason threw for 8. I mean, Gleason threw for 884 yards and 8 touchdowns. To your point, Toledo's backup quarterback has thrown for 800 plus yards, over the last 4 years. And, if Finn stays healthy, let's just say, half of that goes, just say Quinn throws for another 400 yards and 4 of those touchdowns, all of a sudden, that's 2,600 yards and 27 touchdowns on top of a possible 700 plus yard rusher and maybe 8 to 10 rushing touchdowns. Like, that's top 10 worthy right there.
Yeah. I just for shits and giggles, I combined we did bake in a projection for Tucker Gleason.
Yes, we did.
Into the projections. And if you combine those two, Toledo QB1 does sit at 31.5 fantasy points per game. So it's going to be a valuable asset to your fantasy roster.
Yep. Now, Mike, I saved this team for last because this is probably one of the bigger questions we have going into this year. Central Michigan quarterback, Bertie Manuel. I'm not on board. And you might be a little bit more on board than I am, but I just have a problem right now. And I know this might be one that I missed, but I think is particularly in best ball formats for me, at which, the expense at which he comes in, which he could bottom out and I lose completely one full quarterback. But Bertie Manuel over at Central Michigan, let's talk about him because he potentially could be 1,000-yard rusher. I think he only threw 4 passes of all last year. My point of contention is if he's a one-dimensional guy, what's to say he's not going to lose out snaps to Jace Bauer at quarterback? It becomes a split thing. And then my other argument as well was if he's the best runner on the team, why not just move this guy to running back and let him become your 1,000-yard rusher with double-digit touchdowns, which I'm not leaving anything off the table right now. Who knows what might happen, but your guess is as good as mine. I don't know how this is going to unfold at Central Michigan. And right now I'm a little nervous about jumping on the Bertie Manuel train.
Same. Of the 80-something drafts that I've done already this season, that was a joke, but of the many drafts that I've done this season, I have 0 shares of Bertie Manuel. It's interesting. I've read that they feel these quarterbacks are better suited for Paul Petrino's system, but this is the whole question mark that I have with this offense is that you don't have any historical precedent that you utilize a Bertie Manuel type quarterback under a Paul Petrino system. He's not running the triple option, which is essentially what Central Michigan did in that final month of the last season. There's no precedent for Paul Petrino to call that style of offense. So I have 0 shares. I'm surprised that people that drafted Emmanuel haven't selected Jace Bauer in the final round because I truly believe that we're going to see potentially a 2-quarterback system here again, like we saw kind of late last year. The question I have for you is, and I was thinking about this pre-show, say Bertie Manuel doesn't start and Jace Bauer is the starting quarterback. He's not Tom Brady. I think he can run, but he's a little bit more proficient as a passer than Bertie Manuel. And I think you'll see a more traditional style offense with him at quarterback. Are we underrating Marion Lukes at running back if we get a more conventional quarterback like a Jace Bauer starting for Central Michigan? You look at Jim McElwain over the years, 16.9 fantasy points per game from the running back 1 over the last 9 years from Jim McElwain. You have top 10 finishes with Lou Nichols, with Jonathan Ward in the past. I haven't seen Marion Lukes drafted really anywhere too. Just a hypothetical that I'm throwing out. We don't like Bertie Manuel. What if he doesn't win the job?
Yeah, look, I agree with you. I mean, look, the one thing about Jace Bauer, if Central Michigan has to fall back on him, he still ran the ball 53 times for over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns. He can still move. He can still run. Now, he's not Bertie Manuel, who ran for 400, nearly 500 yards and 7 touchdowns in 4 games. But you know what? The counterpoint to the runner is that Jace Bauer was at least a 60% passer. Bertie Manuel threw 8 passes last year, completed 4 of them, right? So it was, and look, I know there was a game where they played in the snow and he probably didn't attempt 1 pass. But still, there's nothing to suggest that Bertie Manuel can even throw the ball. Now, we could be completely off the mark. He could be working on that now, and they might be throwing the ball. Now, look, sometimes you got to read the tea leaves too, right? Because this was a conversation that we had with the tight end that transferred out. Was it Shane Conley?
Cade Conley.
Cade Conley transferred out of Central Michigan to Marshall. And you were probably looking at one of the better positions that was going to get target shares in that offense. And he transferred out of the program. What does that say about the quarterbacks? I don't know. I don't know if it does. But to your point, if Emmanuel doesn't work out as the quarterback and it's Jace Bauer and it's maybe a little bit more traditional, then I think under McElwain, we are definitely undervaluing the starting running back there in the Central Michigan offense. But to that point, like I said, usually McElwain's going to put his best runner at the running back spot, and wouldn't even be surprised if Birdie Manuel doesn't work out at quarterback if he's playing running back. There are just so many uncertainties in this offense that in best ball right now, I don't know how you take a stab, because I almost feel like if you draft one, you've got to draft three. And I'm not willing to kind of invest that kind of, that kind of capital into my best ball roster. Whereas to our point, with a lot of these traditional formats, you're going to take a stab with Birdie Manuel in the preseason because he's kind of got all the hype, and we've seen what he can do when he gets rolling. But if he doesn't do well, you can always drop him and release him. And much to what we talk about in traditional formats, some of these teams you can sit back for 2 or 3 weeks and wait and observe, and then try to find your player through the waiver wire. So it really just depends on the format of the league that you're playing in.
I'll close my point with this. Pre-show, I looked at 2 projected depth charts out there on Central Michigan, and both had Jace Bauer as the starting quarterback. So take it for what it's worth.
There you go. So look, Mike, that's going to do it. Look, we're going to go. We did this last show. We'll do it again. So one question off the college fantasy football record here. And I'm going to go into that headpiece of yours, because I don't know if that thing sticking up on your left ear is a microphone in the air, or is it a Wi-Fi extender? That's what I want to know. That's what everybody's going to want to know.
for when I'm playing video games off air.
There we go, man. All right, look, that's a wrap for the MAC conference. I can't say MAC conference because people are going to get on me for that. That's a wrap for the MAC. Right.
There you go.
That's going to do it for this show in the preseason series. The next show we're going to hit up is going to be the Sun Belt, and that'll take care of the group of 5s before we transition into the P5. So for my partner, Mike Bainbridge, my name's Joe DeSalvo with the Preseason Preview Series over at the CFF site. That does it for the MAC. We'll see you on the next show when we're discussing and talking Sun Belt. See you then. All right, brother. That's it, man. Let's take a deep breath for the night.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right, dude. See you.